In this lesson and the next lesson, we're going to implement a queue class. A queue is similar to a line, such as a line at a grocery store or the line at the bank, any type of line that you get into. The key functions of a queue are in and out. You go in at the back of the line and you go out at the front of the line, or you go in at the back of the queue and you go out at the front of the queue. So the two main data members that we have to keep track of are the front and the back. All right, so let's go ahead and begin our implementation. So we have class queue. In the private section, we have a data store to store the items that go into our queue. We're going to make it string here. Later on, we'll make it generic in another lesson. Back, which will keep track of where the back of the queue is. And then for the front, we're going to create a constant static data member because the front will never change. The front of the queue is always the 0th element of data store. So we'll make that a constant, and because we're in a class, we have to make it static. And that way we can't ever change the front by accident or on purpose. For our public section, first thing we need is a constructor, and it's a very simple one. It simply sets the back variable to -1. We have a method called in, which increments back by 1 and then stores its parameter value at that position, the back position of the queue, or in this case the data store. Next we have out to get out of a line or to get out of a queue. The first thing we do is we store the value that's at the front, the value that's coming out of the queue, into a return variable. Then we have to modify the queue because now the item that's behind the first item in the queue now comes to the front of the queue, and every subsequent item moves up. So we need a function to do that, and we're going to call it shift. And I'll go back in just a second and define that function for you. And then finally we return the return value, although we may not always use that return value. Now, for our shift function, this is not something that's going to be part of the interface of queue, so we're going to put it up in the private section of our class definition. And here's how shift works. We write a for loop that begins at the front of the queue, works its way through to the back, and each element of the array data store is moved up 1. Data store sub I is equal to data store I plus 1, so that the second element becomes the first element, the third element becomes the second element, the fourth element becomes the third element, and so on and so forth. And then the last thing we do with shift is move the back up 1, so we decrement the back variable by 1. So there's our shift method that works in conjunction with out to move an item out of the queue. Last thing I want to do is I want to display the items in the queue occasionally. So I'm going to write a show method. We'll make it part of the public interface so that we can call it from user code. And this one just displays each element of the queue in order. And this way we can verify that our shift method works correctly when an item comes out of the queue. So that ends the definition. So now let's go ahead and write some user code to test our implementation so far. We have other things to implement, which we're going to do in the next lesson. So we're going to do something simple. We're just going to put some letters into the queue. So we're going to say letters in A, letters in B, letters in C. Let's display those. So we'll do a show. Let's take one out. Let's display it again. Let's add another letter in. Let's display. Let's take another letter out. I see that I made a mistake right there. I'll fix that. Okay, so this should be a good test of our implementation so far. We put 3 letters into the queue. We display the queue. We take the first item out. We display the queue again or show it. Put another letter in. Show. Take another letter out. And then show. Let's build and run. And so we've put A, B, C in. We display it. A goes out, we display B and C. D gets added to the queue. Then we take out B, and our queue ends up with C and D. And so far, that looks like the queue's working just fine. So that'll end this lesson on our first pass at implementing a queue class. Now we're going to go in the next lesson and add some utility functions, including being able to see what's at the beginning, at the front, and at the back of a queue at any one time. And we'll see how to do that in the next lesson.